The fixation on missile plumes is a strategic misdirection. The primary attack vector is not kinetic, it is silent. The first strike will be the severing of undersea fiber optic cables and the blinding of orbital assets. This protocol's objective is to create the blind Leviathan, a superpower rendered deaf and blind, with immense kinetic force but no ability to coordinate it. A state facing a terminal solvency crisis, like the one modeled in the Greenland trade war scenario, does not launch missiles into a functioning command and control grid. It first induces systemic paralysis. This silent vector is the prerequisite that makes the gamble of a limited first strike appear mathematically winnable. The pivot from economic policy to kinetic action is not an act of strength. It is the final, desperate transaction of a state facing a systemic solvency crisis. The motive is not conquest, it is survival. When domestic liabilities exceed the state's capacity to pay, the calculus shifts from profit and loss to a zero-sum game of national existence. Consider the Russian Federation. CSIS analysis frames the conflict not as a simple invasion, but as a forced conversion of internal instability into external force. An unpopular war generates immense domestic liability, political dissent, economic isolation, and the depletion of national reserves. This creates a negative feedback loop where the cost of sustaining the war drains the very resources needed to maintain domestic control. This is the core of a solvency crisis. The state is mathematically insolvent, unable to meet its obligations to its own power structures and population. Conventional pathways, economic growth, diplomacy, are foreclosed by sanctions and trade warfare, such as the LNG bazooka mechanism cited by analysts. The state's balance sheet is functionally bankrupt. Faced with a guaranteed economic death spiral, weakness forces a pivot to asymmetry. The strategic logic becomes irrefutable. If the current system guarantees your destruction, your only rational move is to break the system itself. Limited nuclear escalation ceases to be unthinkable. It becomes a viable, if catastrophic, option to reset the global strategic and economic board. Economic weakness is the primary vector for nuclear escalation. The unit economics of modern warfare have been permanently broken. According to analysis from institutions like RUSI, the cost curve has inverted. A legacy platform, a main battle tank, represents a capital expenditure of approximately $5 million. This asset can now be neutralized, mission killed, by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a 10% discount. It is a 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry. This mathematical certainty is the engine behind what strategists term the democratization of violence. The democratization of violence signifies the collapse of the state's monopoly on projecting decisive kinetic force. The industrial barrier to entry has been erased. A nation-state facing a solvency crisis, unable to afford a new generation of fighters or warships, no longer needs to. It can leverage this asymmetry, converting minimal economic input into maximum strategic disruption against a far wealthier adversary. The kinetic cost to impose chaos is now negligible. This is the core accelerant. An economic liability, the inability to compete symmetrically, is converted into an asymmetric kinetic advantage. For a state pushed to the brink by an LNG bazooka or a trade war, the calculus is simple. Why capitulate to economic death when the tools to reset the board cost less than a luxury car? This low kinetic cost makes the gamble of a limited first strike not just palatable, but mathematically logical. It is the cheapest option on the menu. The primary theaters of this economic war are not the headlines. They are the gray zones, the proxy laboratories where weaponized financial protocols are tested. According to RUSI, regional instabilities, such as those flagged in areas from South Africa to Canada, are not the core conflict. They are calibration exercises, staging grounds for a much larger confrontation. These zones serve a single function, to stress test the blueprint for systemic insolvency. It is here that analysts measure the precise amount of economic liability required to trigger predictable kinetic outcomes: riots, military coups, supply chain collapse. This is not chaos. It is a clinical trial to determine the kinetic cost of breaking a nation's will. The Models being refined in these gray zones are the operational prerequisites for deploying strategic-level weapons. The so-called LNG bazooka or a Greenland scenario trade war are not deployed cold. CSIS analysis confirms their effects on a major power are first simulated and field-tested at a smaller scale in these proxy states, allowing for the precise calibration of economic force. Therefore, observing regional instability is like watching a seismograph. It is not the earthquake, but the signal that immense pressure is being applied to the system. These proxy zones are where the final gambit is rehearsed, forcing a peer competitor into a solvency crisis, where a limited first strike, enabled by systems like brilliant pebbles, becomes a mathematical inevitability. The real war is fought in the calculus of economic collapse. The launch on warning doctrine is not a policy of strength. It is a protocol of systemic terror. The architecture is simple. If early warning systems detect an incoming nuclear strike, a retaliatory launch is triggered before the first hostile warhead detonates. The objective is to guarantee the obliteration of the attacker, even if one's own command structure is vaporized. The system's logic bypasses human hesitation. It runs on data, not confirmation of impact. This is a mathematical certainty built into the war machine. This protocol has a critical vulnerability, what intelligence analysts at RUSI refer to as the fog of digital war. A sophisticated cyber attack does not need to disable a nuclear silo. It only needs to blind the radar, or more surgically, feed it false signatures. It creates a phantom apocalypse on the screens of the command authority. The system is no longer processing reality. It is processing weaponized fiction. This transforms early warning radar from a defensive asset into a systemic liability. In this scenario, the commander is presented with a binary solvency crisis. Option 1, trust the data and launch, initiating a kinetic exchange that may be based on a ghost, but which guarantees the state's strategic assets are not lost. Option 2, distrust the data and wait, gambling the nation's existence on the hope that the alarm is false. When a nation is already facing a guaranteed economic death spiral, as detailed by CSIS, its strategic calculus is altered. The kinetic cost of launching on a ghost signal becomes mathematically preferable to the guaranteed extinction of waiting. The cyber attack doesn't cause the war. It forces a choice where launch is the only perceived path to survival. The geopolitical dispute over LNG, identified by analysts as the primary risk for 2026, has created the necessary precondition. The next phase is not overt war. It is data collection. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a 48 to 72-hour attribution impossible shutdown of a strategic European LNG regasification terminal. This will be a cyber-physical event targeting industrial control systems, engineered to appear as a cascading technical failure. CSIS and RUSI models classify this as a calibration shot, a limited, deniable probe to measure the precise political and economic pain threshold required to trigger the EU's bazooka mechanism. It is the final variable needed to calculate the winnability of a limited first strike.